Hi, and welcome back to Heimler's History. Now, in the last lecture we saw how Europe exploded in the craziness that came to be known as World War I. And under the leadership of President Woodrow Wilson, America entered the fray on the side of the Allies, which included France, Britain, and Russia. And even though there are so many juicy tales to tell about World War I, we're going to have to save most of them for our world history lectures. But here we're focusing on American history, and what I'd like to do is show you what was going on in America at home and how America helped win the war in Europe.
It's time to kick it old school.
Now, President Wilson was good at nothing if not rousing idealism in the hearts of the American public. And that's what he had to do now. He had to get all of America on board with this war. And how was he going to do that? I mean, the whole reason why we really got into this war to begin with was because Germany kept sinking our merchant ships. But that doesn't really roll trippingly off the tongue. My fellow Americans, we fight to make the world safe from submarines. To which everyone in the All-American Submarine Club said, "Hey, back off, nerd sniffer." To which Wilson said, "Seriously? You're a member of a submarine club and you're calling me a nerd?" Anyway, Wilson finally landed on gold when he said that we must fight this war to make the world, quote, safe for democracy. And oh, that got Americans all hot and bothered, and we started mobilizing like crazy. But while a lot of folks girded themselves for war, life in America basically went on as usual. Lots of people were getting jobs on account of the War Department's work or fight rule, which said that if you were a grown man that didn't have a job, that you would be drafted into the war immediately. At which point, unemployed men across the nation dropped their Xbox controllers, moved out of their mom's basement, and got a job. But huge numbers of women also flooded the workplace as the men vacated their jobs and went off to war. And if women could handle all the jobs that men were doing, they reasoned loudly, shouldn't they also have the right to vote? Now, at this point in history, there were only 4 groups of people who could not legally vote: criminals, lunatics, those with severe mental handicaps, and, wait for it, women. And in an era of such massive cultural upheaval, apparently it was the right time for women to leave the company of criminals and lunatics and join the fray as those who could exercise their sacred right to vote. And Congress passed the 19th Amendment to make sure that a woman's right to vote would never be infringed. The seeds planted all those years ago at Seneca Falls had finally borne their fruit. And all during this time, America continued to mobilize for war. A drafting bill was passed by a begrudging Congress, and in a matter of 6 weeks, America's standing army of 100,000 had swelled its ranks to over 4 million men. They were called the American Expeditionary Forces, and as green as they were ready to jump into the fray. And as the American Expeditionary Forces began arriving on European soil, they were thrown almost immediately into the teeth of the crushing German assault on Paris. The French couldn't believe what they were seeing. Truckload after truckload of fresh American faces pouring onto the battlefield. And what they lacked in skill, they made up for in numbers. And it was this fresh influx of American soldiers and the German fear of how many more of those truckloads waited to be deployed back home that broke the back of the German offensive, a blow from which Germany never recovered. Now, admittedly, this is a very American-centric version of how the story of World War I goes. But no historian argues that America's involvement in this war had nothing less than momentous consequences. And as victory was announced all across the world, it was Woodrow Wilson who gained an immense amount of popularity. It was reported that there were posters of Wilson all over Italy that were lit by candlelight and looked like some kind of shamanistic democratic guru. It was further reported that Polish university students would find each other in the streets, grab each other's hands, and speak the blessed 2-syllable mantra, "Wilson!" And the news was spread so far that even a guy on a raft in the Atlantic was freaking out about Woodrow. Wilson! And so it was Woodrow Wilson's idealism that would guide the beleaguered European nations into peace. And he did so by means of a grand plan which he called the 14 Points, which contained more or less, 14 points. Now, the most important of these 14 points for our purposes was the last one, which called for a League of Nations. Wilson envisioned a great international assembly with seats for all nations that could talk about conflicts and hug it out rather than taking up arms and shooting each other. And the European nations thought this was a good idea, and so it was adopted into the peace negotiations in the treaty that ended the war, namely the Treaty of Versailles. And some of the other points had to do with treating the losers of the war, namely Germany, with leniency and respect. And it was right about there that the European nations stopped agreeing with Wilson's idealism. From the Allied perspective, Germany's aggression had torn their continent apart and killed their sons in measures never before known. And so the Allied powers were more in a mood to punish Germany than to have a lasting peace. And so they went ahead and crippled the future German economy by laying heavy reparations on them. And there was even a clause in the treaty that blamed the entire war on Germany. But they were just blowing off some steam. I'm sure nothing more significant will come of that. And as Wilson came back across the Atlantic and delivered the good news about the League of Nations to Congress, turns out Congress was not nearly as excited about it as he was. You see, if you remember your Constitution, you'll remember that it is Congress who has the power to declare war. And Congress feared that if we got involved in all of these entangling European alliances, that it was possible that we could get dragged into war without congressional approval. And so ironically, America decided to sit out on the League of Nations, which most historians believe crippled it from the very beginning, and as a result would become a significant cause of the next World War. And more on that later, but for now, I'll see you next time.